The Sega Master System, Sega's answer to the NES. Was it better than the NES? Were there some things better about it? Yes, they were, and we're gonna get right into those. So this is gonna be another system video added to my list of all the video game systems that I've owned from the 2600 all the way up to almost pretty much current. We'll see, right? But the Sega Master System, yes, I did own one. I owned it at the exact same time that I did own an NES. And there's some really funky quirks about it that I would love to talk about, and some personal stories too. So the first thing is the actual system itself. It's a top-down loader system, right? And the NES always had the funky one that you had to stick in like this. But at least the Sega Master System, it was way more reliable because of the top-down loading. You didn't have to blow on the games as much, if at all, and they just always worked. Not only that, they were innovative and ahead of Nintendo in certain areas, and that was the packaging of the games, because the NES games just came in these cardboard boxes that were just packaging and they were thrown in the garbage. Very little of them have survived today, but almost every single solitary game that was done back in the day on Sega Master System, actually the cases, the boxes actually came in a case that held the game on the inside. So almost 100% of those cases still exist even today. Another cool thing about the system too is that if you didn't have any games and you push the power on it, there was a couple of games. So there was a weird snail going through a maze game that you could play if you just turned it on. If you just did that with the NES, you would just get the flashing light and nothing would happen. So I thought that was interesting. Another little quirk about the system is that it had these little hue card games. I don't really know the purpose behind the two game system type thing happening here, but those games were a little bit more primitive than the actual full cartridge ones. There aren't very many of them, and I personally didn't own any, and I didn't even know where you could actually buy them either, or if anyone actually did. So it's interesting to me. I mean, you probably look up the reasoning behind it, but it was a weird quirk. Another weird one too, and we're gonna get into the controller in a second, is that there was a pause button on the actual machine, because the controller didn't have it. And I always remember that would be the most finicky part about the system. If you push the pause button a little bit too hard, or you jiggled the system too much, like you jolted it too much by hitting the pause button very quickly, you could actually freeze the game. Like, it would mess up the game because you kind of jarred the cartridge in there. And I did that one time when I was really far in a game. My parents were calling me up for dinner. They're like, "Get your ass up here right now. We're taking that video game system away from you." And I quickly pushed the pause button to go upstairs for dinner, and the whole game glitched. It crashed, it froze or whatever, and I couldn't get that back, and I was totally pissed. Now the controller, this is where the NES had the edge on them, and I'll tell you a few things why. Because when you look at the thumb pad for the Sega Master System, it only has 2 buttons on it. Yes, that's a whole one extra button that even the Atari joysticks had at the time. So very bad on behalf of Sega. It actually said the start button was actually the A button, or the 1 or 2 button. I can't remember what they were called, but it actually said start over one of them because it didn't have a select or start button. So technically, the NES controller did have 4 buttons on it. And that's why the pause button was actually on the system. But another funky, weird, most bizarre thing about the controller is some of the earlier ones, they had these little notches in the center of the actual D-pad where you could screw in this little tiny plastic joystick into it. Now, I have no idea what the purpose of that was, or if anyone actually used it. The controller, like the actual thumb pad itself, was even slightly smaller than the NES one. So an actual joystick on that, it's just not gonna work. I don't get it. No one used it, and it was one of the most bizarre things I ever thought about that controller. Another interesting thing too is because the plug end was one of those universal ones, it looked the same as Atari as well. And actually, I think it does work with Atari, but what we did find out is that it the Genesis controller did work with the Sega Master System. You could plug it into the back of it and it would work with it. We just discovered that one by fluke. We were just like, well, it plugs in, it looks the same. They're both Sega. Let's just plug it in and see if it worked. And we can't believe it actually did. So if your controllers, because the actual Master System ones, they were notorious for wearing out. Maybe more so than any other controller, especially the D-pad, it would just stop working. Maybe the rubber inside would rip or the connectors would just wear out. It would just stop working. So when that happened, that's how we discovered that you can plug a Genesis controller into it, and it totally worked perfectly. So compared to the NES and competition for it at the time, no surprise, most of the games on the Master System were not better than the NES version, and they didn't have very many games that would like counter each other, like that they were cross-platform games. They kind of came out with their own, but most of them were not that good, save for one that did beat the NES. I shouldn't say not good, sorry, I just meant not better than the NES, except for one, and that was Phantasy Star 1. Sega really wanted to showcase off what the system could do, and that game just buries any chance that the NES had at any game. The three-dimensional mapping in it was amazing for the time. Even when you look at it even today, you can't believe this is on an 8-bit system at all. And the fully animated enemies and bosses that were in the game that would attack you, not to mention that your characters were kind of animated because you could see their different attack slashes and patterns and actual magic spells that would come out on the screen. As good as role-playing games were for the NES, they were nowhere near as advanced as that game. And sometimes that game is so good, I even like to pick it up once in a while, even by today, and still play it. It was one of the biggest cartridges and one of the biggest projects that Sega ever did, and it's the only one, which is a real shame. It's the only one that's that polished for this whole system. Now, of course, I gotta touch on the light gun, because why would they not come out with a system that didn't have a zapper type gun as well? Because Nintendo had one. But you have to remember, when Nintendo came out with the entertainment system, they were marketing it as a toy, not a video game system. It was like an electronic toy that you bought. Then they started stripping things down from it that didn't work and just kept the things that did. So then they took away Rob the Robot and that stuff, and then it was just the system and the zapper gun. And then they took away the zapper gun, and then it was just the system. So Sega and the Master System, they actually had a light gun for theirs as well. Very, very few games for it, and it was nowhere near up to par with the NES one. The NES one had way better ergonomics, especially on the actual handle that felt like a real gun. It was comfortable, and it has one of the most satisfying clicks ever from the actual trigger, where the Sega counterpart version just feels like a block of wood in your hand, and it barely has any spring whatsoever on the triggers, just this flimsy piece of crap. So of course they abolished that right away, but I found that funny, that I was like, that gun just was never the quality of the NES version. So that's my stories and my experience with the Sega Master System. It's a real shame that it didn't do better. I wanted it to do better. I was kind of disappointed when I started getting games for it for the very first time. Like, I got Double Dragon for it because it was 2 players at the same time, and the Nintendo one was only 1 player, but you could clearly see the difference. It's a horrible transition of it's a horrible renderation of the actual arcade. Some games were much better though. Time Soldiers was good. Masters of Darkness is good. It still has a handful of titles that are okay for the actual system, and technically the graphics do look like better. Like, the system runs everything a lot smoother and it's a lot more stable than the NES, but it just didn't take off. It was probably more popular in Europe. I mean, I'm here in Canada, and I'm also talking about United States as well. I think it was much more popular in Europe, and especially more popular in Japan, but Nintendo just frickin'. So thanks a lot for watching, and if you want to see more content like this, click the subscribe button over here, click the thumbs up if you did like the video, or click over here to see me tell you stories about a really good system, or maybe really bad system. And if you don't, I'll just stick my head in a toilet.